Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you for coming to this panel debate organised by the World Federation of the Deaf on the topic of the importance of sign languages as key to unlock the human rights of deaf people to participate in all spheres of society at any time, including in times of crisis. We have interpretation today in International Sign, English and French. If you wish to intervene in sign language, please press your microphone button so that the camera can focus on you. To open the panel today, may I introduce Ms. Tatiana Bingeli, President of the Swiss Federation of the Deaf, to say a few words of welcome.
Dear colleagues, dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Tatiana Bingeli, President of the Swiss Deaf Federation. For me, it is an honor to open this session, and I would like to thank everyone for the invitation, and to all delegates present here today, a warm welcome. Let me formally wish you a happy International Day of Sign Language. And as so aptly put, sign languages do unite us. But let's unpack that a little bit further. There are those in the world who can use sign language, but it's important to remember those who do not know sign language. They face obstacles in their daily life, and those of us who have the knowledge need to impart that wisdom and include people within our culture and our society. Because everyone can learn sign language, and in doing so, then truly sign languages can unite us. In Switzerland, on a national level, we do not actually have our 3 sign languages recognized at a legal level. With the political party shifting in Switzerland in the last couple of years, we have been able to have the Parliament of the People lobbied for our sign languages to be legally recognized, which was successful as of June this year. Our next step on this journey towards recognition is to now approach the next House of Parliament. Once that is complete, we can finally go to the federal level in the hopes that our sign languages of Switzerland will be recognized here. I think today is an apt opportunity to discuss how sign languages unite us here at a national level, but also globally. I'm here to introduce my distinguished colleagues and guests, and I'm more than excited to listen to their contributions from a global perspective.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bingeli. UN Geneva is home to many parts of the UN which are active in crisis situations, and this is reflected in the expertise present on our panel today. Firstly, we have the World Federation of the Deaf, who've organised this panel and is represented here today by its president, Dr. Joseph Murray, and Human Rights Officer, Mr. Alexandre Bloxs. From the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have Ms. Peggy Hicks, Director of Thematic Engagement, Special Procedure and Right to Development Division. From the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we have Ms. Elina, Senior Coordination Officer. And from the United Nations Refugee Agency, we have Ms. Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. In addition, we have an expert presentation by video from Mr. Gabriel Gonzalez, Deputy Minister for Culture of Panama. I look forward to hearing from the expert panel about their experience in ensuring access to those communicating in sign languages to vital information at times of great upheaval and stress. And now it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Joseph Murray, President of the World Federation of the Deaf, to deliver his keynote speech.
Madam Chairpersons, distinguished panelists, honourable guests. The World Federation of the Deaf is delighted to be here at the UN in Geneva to celebrate the 2022nd year of sign languages. The World Federation of the Deaf brings greetings from our 131 country members all around the globe and 70 million deaf people. This event today is part of the International Week of Deaf People. And these celebrations were first established in 1958, and they have been celebrated every year until now. The aim of such a week is to shine a light on deaf people as part of society, to be equal to all others. And deaf people are not yet fully included in all areas of life. That links with the International Week of Deaf People here in 2022, building inclusive societies for all. The theme is very much connected with what has been happening in the world. The world has changed. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic. But the pandemic has taught us a lot. A few things that we must bear in mind that we have learned. Information and assistance has not been delivered equally. In many countries, deaf people have struggled to access information linked with health, and they've struggled to access support. For example, in many countries, deaf communities have informed us that food distribution centres are based on auditory information and are not delivered in sign language, so deaf people have been excluded from the information that's there about food assistance in terms of crisis. The World Health Organization has disability instructions connected to COVID. And it says that governments have a responsibility to provide information in their national country's sign language. And they need to provide access to professional sign language interpreters. And another thing we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic is who is it on the front line of services to the deaf community? It is the deaf associations. All around the globe, national organizations of deaf people responded to issues in relation to health and from the COVID pandemic. One of our national members, the Ukraine Society of Deaf People, once COVID started, they immediately introduced a 24/7 Ukrainian Sign Language interpretation service. And those services continue until today, because Ukraine now faces another challenging situation. And when we have these crises, these activities, we need to have those responses ready and available so deaf people can participate fully. We are now building forward after experiencing the impact of COVID. We need to build inclusivity. How can we do this? Governments, policies, procedures, activities must always include deaf people and their representative organizations. And as it says in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, section 4.3, how do we include deaf organizations? Sign language. We have to have sign language front and center. And if people can access sign language, then their communities will thrive. And this links to today, the International Day of Sign Languages. The International Day of Sign Languages was formally approved by the UN General Assembly in 2017. And the aim was to raise awareness and the importance of sign language for the fullest achievement of the human rights of deaf persons. from its approval in 2017, the Day of Sign Languages has become an international celebration of 200 different national sign languages. Every country in the world has one or even more national sign languages. And these national sign languages are part of the cultural heritage and language diversity of those countries. And you must be proud of your national sign languages. Sign languages are your languages. Sign language has developed very specifically within particular communities, naturally, in the same way that spoken languages develop. The International Day of Sign Languages is a day for every government around the world to recognize and acknowledge their national sign languages as part of their cultural diversity and linguistic diversity within that nation. Now, why? This year's theme, Sign Languages Unite Us. This is why. Sign languages unite deaf babies who are born into a hearing environment, because a sign language will provide a deaf baby with a natural language acquisition. And only sign language will provide a deaf baby with natural sign language acquisition. Sign language unites us. Sign language unites families with deaf children. Sign languages give every person in a family the opportunity to say to each other how much they love each other. So sign languages really do unite us. Sign languages unite children, unite us in education. Deaf children must have the opportunity to learn in an environment, in a school environment, where all the teachers can use sign language. Deaf teachers are using sign language within these educational establishments. There should be a linguistic environment of sign language 24/7. And it must be the case that deaf children are educated with signing deaf peers. Sign languages unite us. Sign languages contribute to economic development. Deaf people can have access to the workplace. They can have opportunities to show their capabilities, to interact with their colleagues and the public in different ways. They can adjust their communication, their languages, and achieve equality. Sign languages unite us. Sign languages unite communities in times of disaster. The 19th World Congress of the World Federation of the Deaf takes place next year in July in Jeju in Korea. And the theme? Human rights in times of diversity. The World Federation of the Deaf invite all human rights organizations that they must include sign language within their work. They must include information and access for their communities using sign language. Why? Sign languages save lives. And I'm delighted to share with you that our keynote presenter for the World Congress next year is Ban Ki-moon, the former General Secretary at the UN. He is known for his enormous contribution to world events. We are delighted to be able to warmly welcome him to our Congress. The theme of the International Day of Sign Languages Unite Us, is a name. It's not a goal that we've achieved yet. In today's world, deaf children are still isolated in local schools with no access to a deaf environment, no access to many language teaching. World Federation of the Deaf says that under 2% of deaf children around the world has access to education within their country's sign language. We now recognize that the deaf community itself is very diverse. Government policies, NGOs must respect the diversity within the deaf community and adapt to fill the needs of those deaf people. We recognize that national sign languages are still taught and should be taught to all people, but we're not there yet. The World Federation of the Deaf Board has an aim to try to celebrate a decade of focus on national sign languages. And our goal is that every country and its national sign language can be accessed by any member of that community, that world. Everyone should be able to learn sign language. We want deaf people to be able to communicate in all aspects of life. We recognize that governments and the deaf community have to achieve this by working together. By working together, we can achieve this important goal of the first human rights convention on linguistic access for deaf people. We understand that sign language is a fundamental human right, and we must recognize it, and we must recognize it as a fundamental human right for every person who is deaf, and that's our aim. The government has to take every action it can to support us to achieve that aim. Sign languages unite us. Today, world governments can join together with us to support the key principles of the convention. And this convention says that deaf people and people with disabilities are part of human diversity. Today, we celebrate this diversity within this International Day of Sign Languages. We are equal, deaf people, people with disabilities, and every other person around the world. Sign languages unite us. Today, we celebrate 2022's Day of Sign Languages. And we want to invite world governments, people around the world, to work together with us and with deaf communities to achieve this important vision. This vision of a world where deaf people everywhere can sign with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Dr. Murray, for your inspiring presentation. Now I would like to politely invite Ms. Peggy Hicks, UNHCR Director of Thematic Engagement, Special Procedure and Rights to Development Division. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy to be able to celebrate with you the 4th International Day of Sign Languages. The celebration of the International Day serves as an annual reminder to states of their obligation to foster, promote, and recognize sign languages as a necessary step for the full realization of the human rights of all people, and particularly of deaf people. The theme of this year's International Week of Deaf People, Building Inclusive Communities for All, Unite Us, as has been said, underscores that there are effectively no human rights for persons with disabilities in the absence of full and effective community inclusion. More than 72 million people communicate in sign languages. For many, sign languages are the main form of communication. Yet many sign languages are not recognized officially, despite the fact that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, with 185 states parties, includes the obligation to officially recognize sign languages. Furthermore, it's also a human rights obligation to recognize and support the cultural and linguistic identity of deaf communities as a minority. Deaf communities and deaf culture and sign languages are part of the dynamic and vital social cultural wealth and heritage of societies. I think Dr. Murray has made that point incredibly effectively, but I want to underline the fact that when we talk about sign language being a fundamental human right, we mean that not just for deaf people, but also in recognition of the fact that whenever any part of our community is excluded, it undermines the human rights of all of us. I've seen that in my own personal life, where I have an aunt who was deaf and who was an inspiration within my family. It makes me think of how much we would have lost if there was not the ability to effectively communicate with her. We need each person of our society to be able to communicate if we want our societies to be as strong as they can be. It should be clear that recognition of sign languages is just a first step, a basic starting point. Too often we see that the collaboration of states with the deaf community falters once a national sign language has been recognized officially. For sign languages to be adopted meaningfully, states must create and reinforce policies that foster and promote sign languages, with sufficient budget allocation and monitoring procedures to continuously improve the implementation of sign language rights. The realization of human rights of deaf people comes via community inclusion, when they can be active members of their communities through relevant participation in education, work, culture, and full access to all services and facilities. Community inclusion is the standard that states must hold themselves to. This need has been recognized by the Human Rights Council in Resolution 4912 as a framework that encompasses a range of human rights and states' obligations to promote the full inclusion of persons with disabilities. The framework of community inclusion is also a timely response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it has had on persons with disabilities. During the pandemic, deaf people face many barriers to accessible information, as has been said, affecting their ability to access related healthcare and services, including vaccinations. Full inclusion of persons with disabilities requires ensuring the necessary care and support systems to live independently in their communities. These systems include a network of services, people, and products that enable them to carry out their daily lives and actively participate in their communities. As said by the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, systematic inclusion of sign languages in the provision of services is essential, including in education, employment, justice, and healthcare. States will not be able to ensure that sign language interpretation services are widely accessible in the absence of a strong community of sign language interpreters and teachers that both the state and private actors can rely on. In doing so, states can ensure the provision of interpretation services and sign language training in a way that is dignified for interpreters and teachers and effective for the deaf community. On our side, our office is progressively implementing the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, achieving tangible improvements on accessibility, reasonable accommodation, and communications. We are committed to continuing to improve our record on UNDIS implementation. Excellencies, the end of linguistic and cultural exclusion for deaf people is much overdue. We have all the necessary ingredients for real change: state commitments, knowledge, and the active involvement of organizations of deaf people. It is time for swift action to ensure community inclusion of deaf people. We hope that when we come together in forthcoming Septembers to celebrate the next International Day of Sign Language, we will do so by recognizing new milestones in progress on this crucial issue. Thank you.
Thank you most kindly, Ms. Hicks. I would like to move on to our next presenter, Ms. Elina Palm, who is the Senior Coordinator Officer of UNDRR. Please, the floor is yours, Ms. Palm.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is really an honor to be part of this important event today. United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is committed to implement the UN disability strategy, and inclusion is an essential principle in our work in reducing disaster risk. As you might be aware, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, this is a document adopted by UN member states in March 2015 in Sendai in Japan, calls for human rights-based approach that is inclusive of and accessible to persons with disabilities. It also requires all disaster risk reduction policies to integrate a disability perspective and promote inclusive decision-making that should be based on solid data that is disaggregated by sex, age, and disability. This is why we are so pleased to be a part of this event today and promote together the importance of sign interpretation, sign languages to foster resilience, inclusion, and disaster risk reduction. When disaster strikes, persons with disabilities are often disproportionately affected and have different and uneven levels of resilience and capacity to recover. Disaster mortality is closely correlated with income and the quality of risk governance. Since the year 2000, almost 90% of the 1.2 million deaths recorded in major reported disasters have occurred in low and middle income countries. In the absence of reliable disaggregated data, we can only estimate how many of those deaths were attributed to persons living with some form of disability, particularly those with reduced mobility, but also those who are deaf or hard of hearing. While there is no systematic disaggregated data collection, there are some examples that illustrate the case. For example, according to some reports, following the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, the fatality rate for persons with disabilities was up to 4 times higher than that of general population. The deaf and hard of hearing persons confronted many challenges as they could not hear the tsunami alarm and they failed to evacuate. Those who were able to evacuate were isolated in shelters as they didn't have access to information and communication. Many sign interpreters were also affected by that disaster and could not help. Persons with disabilities are often socially and logistically isolated in times of disaster, often lacking access to evacuation warnings and appropriate transportation, and lacking any medical equipment necessary for their well-being. The Sendai Framework also recognizes that not only are persons with disabilities disproportionately affected by disasters, but crucially, that their knowledge and leadership skills are essential for building resilient, inclusive, and equitable societies. They can become agents of change in disaster risk reduction when they are fully engaged. This is why the active participation of persons with disabilities, including deaf and hard of hearing persons, in all aspects of disaster risk reduction, planning, programs, and policies is so crucial. In May this year, the 7th session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction was held in Bali in Indonesia. And the theme of this conference was From Risk to Resilience Towards Sustainable Development for All in a COVID-19 Transformed World. We had over 5,000 participants attending this hybrid meeting, and over 3,700 participants were present in Bali from 185 countries. And I was very happy about the great diversity of the people attending the global platform, including by gender, race, age, disability, or socioeconomic status. I was particularly pleased to observe that the number of participants with disabilities had nearly doubled since our last global platform that took place here in Geneva in 2019. This diversity is a reminder of why it is so important we put people first in our plans and decisions. The active engagement of the various stakeholder groups is reflected in the outcome of the global platform, which is called the Bali Agenda for Resilience. The global platform has proven that actively involving persons with disabilities and the organizations working with persons with disabilities in planning and decision making is making a big difference. For the very first time, we had close to 20 deaf participants attending our global platform in Bali. And this was not the case in the earlier events. We had maybe one or two deaf participants or participants who were hard of hearing. Since sign language at the UNDRR global meetings is a very clear and visible sign of inclusion, showing sign interpreters on a big screen in all the sessions was also a way to demonstrate to governments, to member states, the importance of inclusion and our commitment to this area. International sign was not only benefiting the deaf participants, but also the disability community as a whole. And increased inclusion and accessibility has been well recognized by many participants and also by donor community. So, taking place in the lead up to the midterm review of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the global platform was also an excellent opportunity to take stock on progress made, identifying remaining gaps, and also make recommendations on how to further accelerate the implementation of the Sendai Framework, and also to reinforce the culture of prevention, preparation, inclusion, and participation. The global platform made a strong call to all member states, regional organizations, and stakeholders to engage in the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, to identify the corrections in order to accelerate efforts to achieve the goal and the targets of the Sendai Framework by 2030. However, the reality is that much more work remains to be done to reach these goals and targets. This was illustrated in a review that was undertaken last year by the European Disability Forum. The review examined disability inclusive disaster risk reduction policy and practice in 55 countries in Europe and Central Asia. And let me share a couple of key findings from that review. First of all, no examples of systematic data disaggregation were found. Secondly, only 5 countries demonstrated attempts to develop disability inclusive disaster risk reduction policies in line with the Sendai Framework. Third, 6 countries prioritized the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. And lastly, only 1 single country committed funding for disability inclusive civil protection. While the official outcomes of the midterm review of the Sendai Framework will be available only next year, it is already quite apparent that there is an urgent need to accelerate action to reduce the disproportionate impact of disasters on persons with disabilities. Languages connect, and as such, it was very important for UNDRR that sign interpretation was offered at our global meetings. This commitment to offer international sign interpretation in our big conferences and meetings started already when we were preparing for the 3rd UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction that took place in Sendai in Japan in 2015. And this commitment has continued until today. Our regional platforms for disaster risk reduction have started also to offer sign interpretation. And this week, the Asia Pacific Ministerial Disaster Risk Reduction Conference, which is one of the regional platforms, took place in Brisbane, Australia. For this meeting, we had some challenges. It was very difficult to secure international sign interpreters, and then the Australian sign was offered as a predominant form of interpretation. There is a key interest for us as UNDRR to continue offering international sign in the meetings, even beyond the global and regional platform meetings, that we are still encountering some challenges. As I mentioned before, this week's regional platform meeting in Australia, we had, for example, difficulties in hiring the number of interpreters for international sign to cover the full agenda, and therefore the Australian sign was offered. The question for us has been always what sign language should be offered within an international environment. Is the international sign the right language to apply? And how about the meeting in a regional context when the majority of participants might be either French-speaking or Spanish-speaking or Arabic-speaking, for example? So we are still learning on how to do this right. Another challenge we are experiencing is that ad hoc requests for sign interpretation are not possible, and as such it is difficult to have ad hoc meeting with deaf representatives unless the deaf representative bring their own interpreters. So we are looking for guidance from the deaf community to ensure that we can continue and increase the inclusion for all. We are very pleased to have learned about the disaster risk reduction expert group within the World Deaf Federation. We are truly looking forward exchanging with the expert group to help fostering exchanges on the substantive side and overcoming gaps and challenges. Engagement at the national and local level is critical. Aligned with the target E of the Sendai Framework, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and partners are supporting governments in the development of national and local DRR strategies. The engagement of the persons with disability, including the deaf community, is critical in order to ensure these strategies are inclusive and data is disaggregated. Support includes illustration of best practices, best practice examples, gaps, and innovative solutions, including using new technologies, advocacy campaigns, and development of guidance. Similarly, the revision of development of inclusive laws and regulations is another important area for the inclusion of the need and respect of the rights of persons with disabilities. It is now time to accelerate every stage of disaster risk reduction, including designing policies, developing inclusive early warning systems, planning and implementation. Only then we will be able to achieve our global goals. Those are laid out in the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework. We need to move from sporadic engagement to systematic implementation. Thank you for being here today and showing your commitment to this important topic, and I also wish everyone happy International Day of Sign Languages. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Paul. I'd like to move on to our next colleague who will be giving their expert presentation. This is Mr. Alexandre Bloxs, who is the Human Rights Officer at the World Federation of the Deaf. Please, Mr. Bloxs. Thank you kindly, Chair. I'd like to thank you, Chair, distinguished co-panelists, and dear participants who are with us in person and at home. It is my greatest pleasure and honor to be a part of this 2022 edition of the International Day of Sign Languages, alongside distinguished colleagues and co-panelists. As we are aware, the theme is Sign Languages Unite Us, and the purpose of my presentation is to unpack the term unite, unity, to see in tangible examples how we actually work together and unite using sign languages. Because sign language, at the end of the day, is central to this discussion. Sign languages are a catalyst for strong, cohesive deaf communities. We have shared lived experience, and we have shared languages that foster tight-knit communities that are a part of general society. The World Federation of the Deaf have worked in strong collaboration with the United Nations and its bodies. We are tightly interwoven with the various bodies using sign language. It unites us when we access all bodies of the United Nations. We have worked with the High Commission for Refugees, the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNICEF, UNESCO, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and, of course, here. All of these bodies we have approached and worked tightly with, all united, all working together to achieve sign language rights for all deaf persons across the globe. We want to ascertain their human rights. Sign language, therefore, is a cross-cutting theme within the human rights work of the United Nations agencies. It allows the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to ensure that information is disseminated to deaf refugees about their asylum rights in their national sign languages. It ensures that they have access to sign language in their environment. It allows the UNDRR to ensure all three phases of disaster risk reduction, i.e. the prevention phase, the emergency response phase, and the recovery phase, are all inclusive of deaf people through the use of their national sign language. We have worked for many years in strong collaboration with United Nations agencies, but also with our international partners, for example, the Nippon Foundation, who we have worked with to submit the resolution of the second International Conference on Education for the Deaf, which took place in Milan, 1880. We wish to submit this to UNESCO Memory of the World Programme. This resolution banned the use of national sign languages in deaf education, and in favor used a system called oralism, forcing children to hear and to speak. This brought consequences, negative consequences, to deaf education for over 100 years, and we're still seeing the ramifications of such a resolution to this day, where children are not being taught in their national sign languages. This is why we wish to have this resolution recognized as part of UNESCO Memory of the World, to shed light on these malpractices and make them come to an end. Another crucial means to raise awareness on the importance of national sign languages, as has been mentioned by colleagues, is to ensure that governments legally recognize sign languages as official sign languages. This legal obligation is enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 21E. This has been ratified by 185 United Nations member states. The legal recognition of national sign languages are the natural counterpart to the General Assembly resolution on the International Day of Sign Languages, which is also being brought to the national level. Yet still, as of today, 2022, only 72 state parties have recognized their national sign languages through legislative means. This only represents 39% of state parties, with 61% yet to catch up and recognize their national sign languages. This is why the World Federation of the Deaf is in the process of designing a toolkit for sign language rights to guide civil societies and state parties through practical means to ensure strong, robust sign language legislation so that deaf individuals can achieve their linguistic human rights. The release of this toolkit is scheduled for early 2023. We at WFD have a mission. We want to raise awareness, share experiences, and empower stakeholders on human rights of deaf people via sign languages. In this regard, we are delivering capacity building training to our ordinary members. We are currently in cooperation with Thailand, Indonesia, and Singapore, and we continue to deliver these trainings. This incorporates the toolkit on sign language rights. These trainings are perfect momentum to connect to our ordinary members and their national governments. It serves as a platform to ensure that CRPD aim, the spirit of which is nothing about us without us, becomes a reality. And for our members to find common grounds and agreement with their governments on prevalent and important community issues. The World Federation of the Deaf is available, ready, and willing to cooperate with national governments globally. We're willing to cooperate with international organizations, international non-governmental organizations, to ensure that deaf people receive their human rights via sign language, because, as we know, sign languages unite us. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Bloxs. I would like to move on to our next presenter. I welcome Ms. Gillian Triggs of the UNHCR, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. Please, Ms. Triggs.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm really delighted to be part of this very distinguished and experienced panel. I thought I might begin by explaining a little bit about my role as Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the United Nations Refugee Agency. Because as part of that role for protection, essentially, I'm also very privileged to be the champion of disability inclusion. And I thoroughly support Dr. Murray's emphasis on inclusion and, of course, of other contributors as well. Importantly, then, it's important within UNHCR to have some form of organizational commitment under the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. I'd like to join you all in celebrating the International Day of Sign Languages, but to make the very particular point that access to sign language, and that has been mentioned by Mr. Bloxs, access to sign language and services is vital for the protection of deaf people who are forced to flee their homes in search of safety. In our work, we witness daily in our 580 field operations and offices how forced displacement has a devastating impact on the lives of millions of people who are forced to leave their homes. In their journey, they're often separated from their communities and from their families, and they encounter discrimination and linguistic barriers that further contribute to their isolation. For refugees who are deaf, these risks are exacerbated, for they may find themselves separated from the very people with whom that they are best able to talk, using sign language of their own country. They also face additional communication barriers and discrimination to access to essential protection services. And this was the case for Hassan. And some of you may remember in the media seeing this picture. You may be quite familiar with it. It was, of course, the heartbreaking image of Rohingya refugees desperately crossing the borders to Bangladesh in 2017, seeking protection. And one of these images won the Pulitzer Prize, and it depicted an 8-year-old boy in tears climbing up the side of a truck that was distributing food, surrounded by a vast and very anxious crowd begging for food. It's one of those images that everyone thought might be part of the past century and would never be repeated again. But what the world didn't know at that time is that this child was Hassan, a deaf child. Hassan didn't have access to education in sign language in Myanmar, So he and his family and friends developed their own sign language, something I imagine many of you are aware does happen in displaced communities. This, of course, deprived Hassan of accessing any further opportunities. With the support of my colleagues in UNHCR, he finally did get access to informal education, and he learned how to read and write, and how to use a camera to depict the reality of the refugee camp where he lives today at the age of 13. And his picture became the cover of the Rohingya Photographer, a magazine produced by Rohingya photographers. His smiling face is now on the cover, and a sharp contrast to the image of him in 2017, which he holds in his hands. But Hassan still faces risks. His family's worried because sometimes he gets into trouble with people who don't understand him. He's still isolated from the host community in Bangladesh. UNHCR is working with him to connect him with the national organization providing a sign language education. And this is the key point, the importance of national organizations of deaf people and their invaluable role in including refugees. National deaf organizations around the Ukrainian borders demonstrated their capacity to support Ukrainian refugees, such as the Polish Association of the Deaf, which developed an online interpretation service for Ukrainians fleeing and seeking protection, or they produced a series of videos on the reception of deaf refugees from Ukraine, developed by the World Federation of the Deaf and their members. UNHCR has started to collaborate with national deaf organizations to bring sign language interpretation and education into national sign languages for deaf refugees. For example, in Honduras, the UN Refugee Agency and the Honduran Deaf Association have developed training modules and a special edition of the Dictionary of Honduran Sign Language with new signs for protection concepts. In Chile, where Alexandre Salazar, an educator from Venezuela, is learning the Chilean Sign Language in a training organized by the Association of the Deaf of Chile, supported and funded by the UN Refugee Agency. The idea, of course, being to help children who have fled Venezuela and who have arrived in Chile. Our operations, unfortunately, report challenges in providing this type of education and services in sign languages in countries such as Ethiopia and Somalia and other deprived contexts. Our collaboration does need to continue to bridge these communication barriers. Recognizing that multilingualism is a core value of the United Nations and that sign languages are equal to spoken languages, the UN Refugee Agency has raised the standards of its core strategic events. Learning from lessons of the past, and thanks to advocacy made by the World Federation of the Deaf, sign language interpretation has been available in key events for UNHCR, such as the High Commissioner's Dialogue in 2020 and the High-Level Officials Meeting for Refugees and Displaced People in 2021. We hope to maintain these standards in our High Commissioner's Dialogue this year in December, which concerns the protection objectives in relation to all refugees and displaced people, but the connection with the need for development to deal with root causes of conflict that, of course, leads to displacement. But we also want to ensure these standards are well met at the very important Global Refugee Forum in December here at the Palais at the end of next year. And we want to ensure that you all feel included in these discussions, not only at the events themselves, but at all the events that lead up to it. And we hope that you'll have an opportunity to share your experiences and efforts and your ambitions with all the other partners that will be included in these two events. At the first GRF, the first Global Refugee Forum in December 2019, Mr. Juan Angel de Cueva, the president of the Latin American Network of Organizations of Persons with Disabilities, had the opportunity to take part in that forum and to exchange a conversation and ideas with our High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. And from that exchange came our partnership with the International Disability Alliance, which is about to enter its third year. We hope that further collaboration with the World Federation of the Deaf will bring opportunities for deaf refugees, for those who are internally displaced and those who are stateless, to access assistance and protection and to achieve full inclusion in their communities. We also recognise that we need to do more internally within the UN Refugee Agency itself. Today, all our colleagues in UNHCR will receive a message with information on the importance of sign languages, with illustrations of the key signs to start raising awareness in our own workforce. So this event is an opportunity for us to renew our commitment to solidarity and to inclusion through multilingualism. It's a core value of all our work, and as we all understand, sign languages can bring unity. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Triggs. I will invite our next speaker, Mr. Gabriel Gonzalez, who is the Deputy Minister for the Culture of Panama, Minister for Culture of Panama. I believe it will be a video presentation.
Saludos, mi nombre es Gabriel González y esta es mi seña. Yo, en el Gobierno Nacional de Panamá, soy el Viceministro de Cultura. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Que nos enfocamos en diferentes aspectos, entre ellos la cultura inclusiva para diferentes grupos vulnerables. Por ejemplo, saludos, mi nombre es Gabriel González, comunidades afrodescendientes y grupos originarios. Y la idea es poder apoyarlos a todos. Ahora, en mi disertación quiero enfocarme en la lengua de señas, la cual es de gran importancia a nivel mundial. Cuando buscamos lengua de señas, podemos percatarnos que existen distintas lenguas de
We apologize for the technical hiccup here, and we will try
Gobierno
to
Nacional
run
de
it again.
Panamá. Soy el Viceministro de Cultura. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Que nos enfocamos en diferentes aspectos, entre ellos la cultura inclusiva para diferentes grupos vulnerables. Por ejemplo, personas con discapacidad, personas sordas, comunidades afrodescendientes y grupos originarios. Y la idea es poder apoyarlos a todos. Ahora, en mi disertación quiero enfocarme en la lengua de señas, la cual es de gran importancia a nivel mundial. Cuando buscamos lengua de señas, podemos percatarnos que existen distintas lenguas de señas establecidas a nivel mundial, las cuales pueden dar riqueza a la comunidad sorda, permitiendo que podamos comunicarnos e interactuar. Esto es importante para nuestro país, al igual que para el mundo. Me gustaría informarles a ustedes, aquí en la ONU, que el apoyo que se debe dar a la lengua de señas es muy importante a nivel mundial y las necesidades que existen son muchas. En el mundo hay muchos niños sordos que carecen de la educación. Debemos darles la oportunidad de enseñarles lenguas de señas para que obtengan el conocimiento en su propio idioma y que puedan comunicarse con personas sordas o con oyentes. Esto gracias a la inclusión. ¿Qué significa inclusión? La inclusión significa que la lengua de señas puede estar inmersa en cualquier grupo, ya sea comunidades afrodescendientes, asiáticas, originarias. La idea es poder comunicarnos entre todos. Igual, los oyentes también deben tener la oportunidad de aprender lengua de señas. Por ejemplo, si la comunidad sorda prefiere utilizar la lengua de señas, ¿qué ocurre con los oyentes que ya aprendieron español, inglés y demás como primera o segunda lengua? Entonces, deberíamos agregar la lengua de señas para eliminar esas brechas, que todos podamos ser iguales y que exista más respeto a los derechos humanos entre todas las personas. En nuestro país queremos motivar a que más personas establezcan cursos para la enseñanza de la lengua de señas. ¿Quiénes serían los encargados de esas enseñanzas? Personas identificadas como personas sordas, con el conocimiento que permita que los estudiantes puedan aprender lo que significa la lengua de señas, su riqueza y cómo permite la comunicación e interacción. En Panamá es complicado, ya que no existen escuelas de enseñanza donde se pueda aprender a través de la educación. Hay escuelas en inglés, hay escuelas en francés, pero no hay una escuela en la que se pueda enseñar la lengua de señas para sordos y debería abrirse esta oportunidad y apoyar. Pedimos el apoyo para esto. Este apoyo es de vital importancia. De hecho, el Ministerio de Educación ha establecido un programa que vela por la importancia de la lengua de señas y sentimos que este apoyo es de vital importancia para darles la oportunidad a todos los niños sordos. Aquí en el Ministerio de Cultura no somos los únicos encargados de esto, sino que hay diferentes instituciones de gobierno que dan este apoyo, con cursos, capacitaciones, enseñando a los niños y niñas y que aprendan. Desde el Gobierno Nacional, liderado por el presidente Laurentino Cortizo Cohen, hemos asumido el reto e iniciamos conmigo. Como persona sorda, desde la posición de Viceministerio de Cultura de Panamá y como parte del gabinete del gobierno, es necesario para mí comunicarme con todos los demás en lenguaje técnico de alto nivel, permitiendo así la entrada de intérpretes en lengua de señas que permita la accesibilidad. Queremos que todos en el mundo estén equiparados, sin distinción alguna, en total inclusión, ya sea sordo u oyente. Para el Gobierno Nacional, esto significa que toda información transmitida debe venir en la lengua de señas y ésta permita empoderar a la comunidad sorda. Ese impacto que tiene el gobierno es de vital importancia para cerrar brechas. Muchas gracias por su atención. Un saludo a todos.
Thank you very much for your video presentation. I believe that brings us to the end of our formal presentation by our panelists, but as we see, we've explored a lot of different themes, which brings us to our discussion. As we recognize, sign language unites us, and we've had some idea about how that is done tangibly. But we need to consider those who do not have sign language and no access to sign language as of yet. And we need to ensure, as we've heard on this panel, that they're empowered to access sign language and access the world. Only that way can we truly unite everyone with sign language. I would like to ask Dr. Joe Murray first, what are your takeaways and the important aspects for future development to ensure that sign languages unite us?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my takeaways from the panel have been very exciting. I think there are many activities taking place around the world. It's important that we achieve these sign language rights. I think for us that's the first step to unite us through sign languages, because everyone around the world has to have the right to access their national sign language at any point and in any sphere of their everyday lives. And we can get this through legal recognition of a country's sign language. And we need to spread awareness of sign languages. We also need to be very careful that we ensure that a budget is available to provide information and access to services in sign language. I'm delighted to see there are many activities taking place on a global level that recognizes this need for deaf people to have sign language. But the practical implications of this are something we need to be very careful about. We have this right, and we have a right to spread the languages through this linguistic diversity of the world's peoples. We want everyone to be able to learn their country's sign language. And as I said, the World Federation of the Deaf has a vision of a world where deaf people anywhere can sign everywhere. And so let's start with a formal recognition and practical implementation of the rights to sign language.
Thank you. I would like to ask the same question of all panelists, and please keep it brief. With the theme in mind of Sign Languages Unite Us, how can we make that a practical, tangible reality? If we could kindly start with Ms. Palm and then work our way through the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator and distinguished panelists and all the participants. As I mentioned during my intervention, we as UNDRR, we have come a long way. We have learned a lot by doing. Since 2015, our goal was really to remove the barriers, not only the physical barriers when we organize our conferences, but really to make sure that persons with disability, deaf and persons with hard of hearing, that they have access to the content, to the dialogue, to be able to express themselves. Because in particular in the area of disaster risk management, we think it has to be inclusive. There is no way of having good, efficient disaster risk reduction policies at the national and local level if they don't include the views and guidance from persons with disabilities. So I think that's one thing that is important for us. We remain committed on that. I also mentioned that there are still a lot of challenges. One is this lack of disaggregated data. We are working on that. Actually, my colleague Stephanie Danneman, who is here with us, she's the focal point for the UNDI's implementation and is working very hard. She has included this in our work plan. So that's a practical implementation. It's part of our office work plan to make sure that we have this aspect included in different work streams that we are doing, not only organizing the conferences, but also in the data collection on disasters, etc. And I would like to maybe say the final point. I did refer in my intervention on this midterm review of the Sendai Framework. So the Sendai Framework is a 15-year plan of action that member states had agreed on how to reduce disaster risk. It has 7 targets, it has as one goal, and we are currently having this midterm review of that Sendai. It's 7 years of implementation this year. It goes until 2030. I would like to encourage the deaf community to be actively engaged in the consultation process. There will be a report prepared by the Secretariat that will be ready in January. And there will be a political process in New York that will culminate with the high-level event, high-level meeting in May in New York. I think it would be important to have the deaf community fully engaged in that to shape really the outcomes of that review. And finally, I would just like to thank again the organizers, and we look forward to working with all of you very closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Palm. I would like to ask the same question of Ms. Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for the Protection of UNHCR.
Well, thank you very much. And as when I was speaking, I was mentioning in particular the kind of work that we're doing and have been doing in Honduras and Chile. Training is really critical. And I think we will continue to ensure that we raise the funds to maintain that training. But also I think, and it's been mentioned by other members of the panel, the importance of ensuring a much stronger global understanding of the needs of people who are deaf. And that's why we're really, it was serendipitous in some ways that this extraordinary picture of Hassan should, on closer research, demonstrated that he was in fact deaf. Now, you know, we obviously have to be very careful about how we use children to promote our advocacy on any particular element of disability. But all of that was clear, I might add. But the key point is that when you have a story like that, it's a wonderful tool for communication and advocacy when we can move hearts as well as minds, in a sense. And so we have to, of course, ensure we have better data and disaggregated data. We have a massive field operational presence, and we have the opportunity to do this, but we have not done it in any systematic way. So I think what I'd see us improving is getting the data. But we must have the data if we're to inform our advocacy, to encourage donors to provide us with the funding. But what will actually often make the difference is the story, for people to really understand that we have very, very high percentages of people with disabilities who are fleeing violence and persecution, sometimes as the result of climate change, but typically as a direct result of conflict. You know, that's of course our focus. So I think if I were to try to sum up, I think it's certainly training, techniques like establishing dictionaries, advocacy, improved communication and data collection. Collaboration with partners like the World Federation is also critical. We do almost nothing on our own at the UN Refugee Agency, and so that collaboration is important. But I'd like to finish with the final word that has been made by many of our panelists, and that is inclusion. If we work as hard as we can with our partners and through advocacy to ensure that people with disabilities, but in this case particularly people who are deaf, are included in access to education, social services, political participation, that they have a place at the table, that they're engaged in decisions that concern them. This is, I think, a critical element, and those are all the kinds of elements that we are working on with the UN Refugee Agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution. We see that sign languages are important and need to be on the ground practically, as has been mentioned by our distinguished colleagues. And only when that happens can sign language users achieve their human rights and experience culture, political participation, the same as everyone else. Sign language is a part of our society and a part of our diversity and humanity. I would like to thank all our distinguished panelists for their contributions, for their presentations. They've given us a very clear idea of the state of play and how we can work and strive towards equity in the future. Equity for sign language users is with sign language, and we have to remember that sign languages unite us all. I would like to give the final word for this panel to the President of the World Federation of the Deaf, Dr. Joe Murray.
I want to say thank you to our moderators and distinguished guests. Last week, the World Federation of the Deaf Board met in Namibia. We were invited by the Namibian Association of the Deaf, and they invited the WFD board to go there to have an opportunity to meet people from different places and meet with representatives of the Namibian government. The Namibian Association of the Deaf has 3,000 deaf people as members of their association. Now that shows the power of the deaf community being together. One association, we are 131 national country members as part of the WFD, and that was just one of our members. And we had a marvelous experience meeting various government representatives and explaining to them their responsibility to recognize Namibian Sign Language and support Namibian deaf people and include Namibian deaf people as part of their society. I think I have to applaud the Namibian government representatives. Every minister we met said, yes, you're absolutely right. It's something we will do. And that, yes, we're seeing that more and more now in different countries around the world. Deaf people experience more and more, yes, that part of diversity that we can belong to. And people are saying, yes, you're right. National sign languages are part of us, are part of our human language bank. It's a fundamental human right for you. National sign languages are our joint responsibility, they said. And today is International Day of Sign Languages. I want the World Federation of the Deaf to say to you, congratulations for your commitment, to you representatives from around the world. This is a very important day for all people and all languages, our national sign languages. Thank you for coming, thank you for watching, and I hope you all will continue to celebrate this very important day. Thank you.